Go ahead, my daughter-in-law whispered with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Read it. We've been waiting for this. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began to read, but then he stopped mid-sentence, his voice catching in a way that made the entire room go still, and that was the moment I knew I had given them exactly what they deserved. I didn't react, not when Rachel squeezed Daniel's hand with barely contained excitement, not when my son leaned forward in his chair as if the words on that page were already his, not even when the silence stretched long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. I simply sat there, hands folded neatly in my lap, the same way I had sat through years of quiet dismissals, subtle exclusions, and carefully disguised disrespect that had slowly turned my own family into strangers. 2 days earlier, the house had been unbearably quiet, the kind of silence that settles into the walls after loss and never quite leaves, and I had been standing at the kitchen window, looking out over the backyard that my husband and I had spent 32 years building together, every flower bed and every stone path carrying a memory that no one else seemed to value anymore. Daniel used to call every Sunday, used to stop by with coffee and stories about his week, but those visits had grown shorter, then less frequent, and eventually replaced by polite text messages that felt more like obligations than affection, and Rachel had always been right there in the background, guiding the tone, shaping the distance, deciding how much of me was still allowed in their lives. I remember the first time I noticed it clearly, the way she spoke about the house not as a home, but as an asset, something with square footage and resale value, something that could be liquidated and divided, her voice smooth and practical as she talked about what makes sense for the future, as if the life I had built here was already something to be closed out and filed away. That afternoon, I had gone upstairs to the bedroom and opened the drawer where my husband kept his documents, running my fingers over the neat stacks of papers, the careful organization that had always been his way of taking care of us, and I had felt something shift inside me, something quiet but firm, like a decision that had been waiting for the right moment to finally take shape. Later that evening, I heard them before they knew I was there, their voices drifting from the living room, low but not low enough, Rachel's tone confident, almost amused as she said, "Once everything's finalized, we can sell the place within a month, maybe less if we price it right." And Daniel's response was softer, hesitant for just a second before he agreed. That brief pause, the only sign that somewhere, buried deep, he still remembered who I was to him. But it wasn't enough. It had never been enough. And I stood there in the hallway, unseen, listening to my future being discussed as if I were already gone. I didn't confront them, didn't let them know I had heard a single word, because in that moment I understood something they hadn't considered, something they had underestimated. And that was the fact that silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's preparation. The next morning, I made a phone call, my voice steady as I asked Mr. Collins to meet me. And when I sat across from him in his office, the sunlight coming through the blinds in narrow lines across the desk, he looked at me carefully, as if he could sense that this wasn't just another routine appointment. And I told him exactly what I wanted, every detail precise, every condition intentional. And when he hesitated, when he asked if I was absolutely certain, I simply smiled and said, "I want to give them exactly what they've been asking for," because I knew that what people reveal in moments of comfort, in whispers they think no one hears, says more than anything they could ever admit out loud, and I had been listening for a very long time. Now, sitting in that quiet room as the lawyer struggled to continue reading, I watched the confidence on Rachel's face begin to flicker, just slightly. Just enough to hint that something wasn't unfolding the way she had expected, and Daniel glanced between us, confusion starting to replace certainty, and still I said nothing, because some truths don't need to be explained, they only need to be revealed at the right moment, and that moment had finally arrived. I watched the lawyer's hand tremble slightly as he adjusted the document, the crisp paper suddenly seeming heavier than it had a moment before, and in that pause, in that fragile silence, I could feel the entire room shifting, like something invisible had just cracked beneath the surface, something none of them had prepared for, and yet I had been preparing for this moment longer than any of them could possibly understand. Daniel leaned forward, his brows knitting together in confusion, his voice breaking the quiet with a strained edge as he asked, "Is there a problem?" And Mr. Collins cleared his throat again, buying himself a few seconds. But those seconds were enough for Rachel to turn her head slightly toward me, her eyes narrowing just a fraction, as if she were trying to read something in my expression that had not been there before, something that did not match the outcome she had already decided was hers. I remained still, my posture unchanged, my hands resting calmly in my lap, the same way I had trained myself to sit through years of small dismissals that had slowly taught me how to become invisible in my own home, how to observe without reacting, how to listen without being heard, and how to wait without being noticed. It had not happened all at once, not the distance, not the quiet rearranging of roles within my own family, but rather in pieces so small they were almost impossible to confront in the moment, like the time Rachel insisted on hosting holidays at her house because it was more convenient, or the way Daniel stopped asking for my opinion on anything that mattered, replacing conversations with updates, as if I were someone who needed to be informed rather than included, and I had told myself that. It was normal, that this was what happened when children built their own lives, that stepping back was part of growing older, but deep down, I had known the difference between being respected from a distance and being gradually pushed aside. Mr. Collins finally continued, his voice slower now, more deliberate, as though he were choosing each word carefully, aware that whatever came next would not land the way anyone in that room had expected. And as he read, I could see the subtle changes begin to unfold, the way Daniel's shoulders stiffened, the way Rachel's confident smile began to tighten, the way her fingers loosened slightly from their grip on his hand, and I wondered if she was remembering the conversations she thought were private, the plans she believed were secure, the assumptions she had built her certainty upon. 2 days earlier, when I had sat in that office and explained exactly what I wanted, I had not raised my voice, had not needed to justify my reasoning, because the truth had already justified itself, revealed quietly in the choices they had made when they thought no one was watching, and Mr. Collins had listened carefully, his expression thoughtful, his pen pausing more than once as if he were considering the weight of what I was asking. And when he finally spoke, he said, "This will change everything." And I had simply nodded, because everything had already been changed long before I ever stepped into his office. Back in the room, Rachel shifted in her seat, her posture losing the effortless confidence she had carried in just minutes earlier, and she glanced at Daniel again, this time not with excitement, but with a flicker of uncertainty, and he noticed it. I could tell he did, because his expression softened for a moment in a way that reminded me of the boy he used to be, the one who would look to me when he did not understand something, the one who trusted me to make things right. But that moment passed quickly, replaced by the man who had learned to trust someone else more, even when that trust was built on something far less steady than he believed. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in around the realization that was slowly taking shape. And still, no one had looked directly at me. Not yet. Not in the way that acknowledged my presence as something more than an afterthought. But that would come. I knew it would, because there are moments when truth demands to be seen, when it refuses to remain hidden any longer. And this was one of those moments, unfolding not with noise or confrontation, but with quiet precision, exactly the way I had intended. Mr. Collins paused again, and this time the silence felt deliberate, as though even he understood that what he was about to say could not be softened or rushed, and when he resumed, his voice carried a weight that settled over the room, like a slow realization unfolding in real time. In accordance with the final amendment, any beneficiary who has demonstrated intent to prematurely claim, transfer, or profit from the estate prior to its lawful distribution shall be considered in violation of the conditions set forth and will forfeit all rights to inheritance. And for a brief second, no one moved, no one spoke, because the words had not yet fully landed. They were still hovering somewhere between understanding and denial, and I watched as Rachel's expression shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small fractures, the kind that reveal themselves only when someone realizes the ground beneath them is no longer steady. Daniel blinked, his gaze flickering between the lawyer and the document, as if searching for a version of the words that would make more sense, that would align with what he had expected to hear, and I could see the calculation beginning behind his eyes, the quiet attempt to reconcile what he knew with what he was now being told. And it reminded me of all the times he had chosen not to ask questions, all the times he had accepted Rachel's version of things because it was easier than looking deeper easier than confronting the possibility that something was not right. Rachel leaned forward slightly, her voice controlled but tighter than before as she said, "I do not understand. There must be some mistake. We have not done anything wrong." And there it was, that familiar tone, polished and confident. The same tone she used when explaining away small inconsistencies, when reshaping narratives to fit her advantage. But this time, it lacked the certainty it once carried. This time there was a subtle edge beneath it, something closer to urgency than assurance. Mr. Collins did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned a page, his movements measured, and then he continued, reading directly from the document without looking up. "The determination of such intent shall be based on verifiable actions, including but not limited to discussions, arrangements, or agreements made regarding the sale or redistribution of assets prior to the execution of this will." And as those words settled into the room, I saw it. The exact moment recognition crossed Rachel's face, the brief flicker of memory, the realization that what she had said, what she had planned, what she had assumed was private, had not been as hidden as she believed. Daniel turned to her then, his confusion sharpening into something more pointed, something that carried the first hint of doubt, and he said her name quietly, not accusing, not yet, but questioning in a way that suggested he was beginning to see something he had not allowed himself to see before, and she met his gaze for only a second before looking away, that single movement speaking louder than anything she could have said. I sat there, still as ever, feeling none of the urgency that had begun to ripple through the room, because this was not unfolding unexpectedly for me. This was the result of a truth that had already been revealed, already been understood, long before this moment arrived. And I remembered standing in that hallway, hearing their voices, hearing the certainty in Rachel's plans, the ease with which she spoke about selling the house, about moving forward as if I were already part of the past, and I had realized then that there are some things you cannot argue against, some things you cannot fix with conversation or compromise, because they are not misunderstandings, they are intentions. "This is ridiculous," Rachel said, her composure slipping just enough to expose the strain beneath it. "We were only discussing possibilities. That does not mean anything." But her words did not carry the same weight they once might have, not in a room where the truth had already begun to take shape, not in front of a document that did not rely on interpretation but on condition, on consequence, on the quiet certainty of what had been put into place. Mr. Collins finally looked up, his expression calm but firm as he added, "The amendment was made with full awareness and intent, and it is legally binding." And that was when the room shifted again, more noticeably this time, as if the last layer of assumption had been stripped away, leaving only what remained, and slowly, almost reluctantly, both Daniel and Rachel turned to look at me, really look at me, not as an afterthought, not as a formality, but as the person who had made this decision, the person who had set this in motion. And I met their gaze without changing my expression, without offering explanation or justification, because everything that needed to be said had already been written, already been read, and finally, after all this time, it had been understood. No one spoke for a few seconds after that, and in that silence, something deeper than confusion began to take shape, something heavier, something closer to recognition, and I could see it most clearly in Daniel, the way his shoulders lowered slightly, the way his eyes lingered on me just a moment longer than before, as if he were trying to reconcile the woman sitting in front of him with the version of me he had slowly learned to overlook. "Mom," he finally said, his voice quieter now, stripped of the confidence he had carried into the room. And there was something in the way he said it, something that reminded me of the boy he used to be, the one who would come running into the kitchen after school, dropping his backpack by the door and asking what was for dinner, the one who trusted that I would always be there, always steady, always certain. But that boy had grown into someone who had learned to look past me, to listen to someone else's voice more than mine, and I did not interrupt him as he searched for the right words, because I had learned that sometimes silence gives people exactly what they need, the space to hear themselves clearly. Rachel, however, did not wait, her composure tightening again as she straightened in her chair, her voice controlled but edged with frustration as she said, "This cannot be what you intended, Margaret. There must have been some misunderstanding when this was drafted." And I turned my head slightly to look at her, really look at her, Not as the woman my son married. Not as the person who had slowly reshaped the dynamics of this family, but simply as someone who had revealed exactly who she was. Through the choices she believed no one would question. There was no misunderstanding, I said, my voice calm. Even the kind of calm that does not come from indifference but from certainty. And for the first time since the reading began, I could feel the shift in the room focus entirely on me, not as a background presence, not as someone to be managed or redirected, but as the person who had made a decision they could not undo. Rachel opened her mouth as if to respond, but the words did not come. Immediately, and in that hesitation, I saw something she had never allowed herself to show before. Not weakness, not exactly, but a loss of control, a realization that the outcome she had planned so carefully was no longer hers to direct. Daniel looked between us, his confusion deepening into something more complicated, something layered with questions he had never asked before, and I wondered if he was remembering the small things now. The conversations he had not paid attention to, the moments he had dismissed because they did not seem important at the time, the way Rachel would speak for both of them, the way decisions would be made without ever including me. And I did not need to say any of that out loud, because the truth has a way of assembling itself when someone is finally ready to see it. You heard us, he said suddenly, the realization landing in his voice as he looked at me more directly, and I held his gaze without hesitation, without anger, without the need to defend myself, because there was nothing to defend. I listened, I replied, and that was all. No elaboration, no accusation, just the quiet acknowledgement of something that had already happened, something that could not be taken back or reinterpreted. Rachel leaned forward again, her voice sharper now, the careful polish beginning to crack as she said, "People talk about possibilities all the time. That does not mean anything was decided." But even as she spoke, there was a strain beneath her words, a tension that suggested she knew exactly how those conversations might be perceived when placed against the conditions that had just been read. I did not raise my voice, did not match her urgency, because I did not need to, and instead I said, "You did not speak like it was a possibility. You spoke like it was already yours." And the room went still again, not because of the volume of my words, but because of their precision, because they reflected something that could not be easily dismissed or explained away. Daniel looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time, I saw doubt take hold in a way that could not be softened or redirected, and Rachel looked back at him, her expression shifting rapidly, as if she were searching for the version of herself that had always convinced him before. But something had changed, something had already been exposed, and no amount of careful wording could fully cover it now. I sat there, steady and composed, not because I felt nothing, but because I had already felt everything that needed to be felt long before this moment. In quiet rooms and empty spaces where no one had been there to witness it, and what remained now was not hurt or anger, but clarity, the kind that comes when you finally see people exactly as they are, without the comfort of assumption or the illusion of intention. And in that clarity, there was no need to argue, no need to persuade, because the truth, once revealed, speaks for itself. Daniel did not speak right away, and that silence said more than any argument could have, because it was the kind of silence that forms when something familiar begins to feel unfamiliar, when trust starts to shift in ways that cannot be easily reversed. And I could see it in the way he looked at Rachel now, not with the automatic agreement he had relied on for years, but with a quiet uncertainty that had finally found its way to the surface. Rachel noticed it too. I could tell she did, because her posture changed again, more rigid this time, her shoulders lifting slightly, as if bracing against something she could not quite control, and her voice, when she spoke, carried a sharper edge than before. "Daniel, you know this is not fair. We were only planning ahead. Anyone would do the same thing." And she turned toward him fully now, trying to pull him back into the version of events she had always presented, the one where everything made sense, where every decision was practical, reasonable, justified. But Daniel did not answer her immediately, and that hesitation stretched between them like a thin line that neither of them could ignore. And for the first time, I saw him hesitate to accept her explanation without question. Mr. Collins shifted slightly in his chair, his presence still calm but attentive, as if he understood that what was happening now was no longer just about legal language or formal documents. but about something more personal, something that had been building quietly beneath the surface for far longer than any of us had acknowledged. The amendment was added very recently, he said, his tone neutral, factual, and it was done with full clarity and without any external influence. And those words settled into the room with a quiet finality, reinforcing what had already begun to take shape, that this was not an oversight, not a misunderstanding, but a deliberate decision made with full awareness of its consequences. Rachel let out a small breath, almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it, and she shook her head slightly, as if trying to dismiss what she was hearing as something temporary, something that could still be corrected. Then we can fix it. There must be a way to correct this, to clarify what was meant. And I watched her carefully, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of distant understanding. Because I had seen this before, the instinct to regain control, to reshape a situation before it fully settled into reality. It is already clear, I said, my voice steady, not raised, not forced, simply present. And she looked at me then, really looked at me, her eyes searching for something that was no longer there, perhaps expecting hesitation, perhaps expecting uncertainty, but finding neither. Daniel finally spoke, his voice lower now, more thoughtful than before. Mom, why did you not say anything earlier? And it was a fair question, one that carried more than curiosity. It carried a quiet regret, a realization that something important had been missed, and I met his gaze without hesitation. Because you were not listening, I said, and I did not say it with bitterness, did not say it to accuse him, but simply as a truth that no longer needed to be softened. And he looked down for a moment, his expression tightening as if those words had landed somewhere deeper than he expected. Rachel crossed her arms now, her composure slipping further as she tried to regain footing. This is extreme, Margaret. You are punishing us for a conversation, for something that had not even happened yet. And I tilted my head slightly, considering her words, not because they held weight, but because they revealed exactly what she believed, that intention did not matter unless it was acted upon, that planning something quietly somehow made it less real. You had already decided, I replied, and again, I did not need to say more, because the simplicity of it carried everything that mattered, and the room fell quiet once more, not with confusion this time, but with something closer to acceptance, the kind that comes slowly, reluctantly, but inevitably when there is nothing left to reinterpret. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face as if trying to process everything at once, and when he looked up again, there was something different in his expression, something more grounded, less certain, but more aware, and I realized then that this moment was not just about what they would gain or lose. It was about what had already been revealed, about the way people show you who they are when they believe the outcome is already secured, and I had simply chosen to believe them. Daniel's gaze did not leave me this time, and there was something unsettled in it, something that had finally broken through the certainty he had carried for so long, and I could see him trying to piece together not just what had happened here in this room, but everything that had led up to it, every conversation, every moment he had dismissed without question, every time he had chosen the easier explanation over the more difficult truth. So that is it, he asked quietly, not with anger, not yet, but with a kind of disbelief that suggested he was still hoping there was something more, something that could be undone, and I held his gaze as I answered. That is it. Because there was no reason to soften it, no reason to pretend that this was anything other than the natural conclusion of what had already been set in motion. Rachel shook her head again, more firmly this time, as if refusing to accept a reality that no longer aligned with her expectations. No, this is not how this works. People make plans, they talk about the future. That does not mean they should lose everything over it. And her voice rose slightly, not enough to be considered loud, but enough to reveal the frustration she was no longer able to contain. And I noticed how quickly she shifted from explanation to insistence, from reasoning to resistance, as though she believed that if she pushed hard enough, the situation might bend back into something she could control. Mr. Collins remained composed, his hands resting neatly on the table as he spoke again. The terms are very specific, and they were agreed upon with full understanding of their implications, and his words carried a quiet authority that did not invite argument, only acknowledgement, and for a moment, Rachel looked as though she might continue to push back. but something in his tone, something in the finality of his statement, seemed to stop her just short of doing so. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, exhaling slowly as if trying to steady himself, and I could see the shift happening more clearly now. The way he was beginning to separate what he had believed from what was actually in front of him. The way his thoughts were no longer moving in a straight line, but branching out, questioning, reconsidering, and it was not an easy process. I knew that, because clarity rarely is. "You could have told me," he said after a moment, his voice softer again, and I considered that, not because it was something I had not already thought about, but because it reflected something deeper, a belief that if he had known sooner, something might have been different, something might have been prevented. "Would it have changed anything?" I asked, not as a challenge, not as a test, but as a genuine question, and he did not answer right away, his silence speaking for him as he looked down, his expression tightening in a way that suggested he already knew the answer. Rachel turned to him quickly, her voice urgent now. "Of course it would have. We would have handled things differently. We would have explained. We would have made sure she understood." And there it was again, that instinct to reshape the narrative, to present an alternative version of events where intention could be softened, where impact could be minimized. But Daniel did not respond to her this time, not immediately, and that pause stretched between them in a way that felt significant, as though something that had always been automatic was no longer so certain. I watched them both without interrupting, without stepping in to guide the conversation, because this was not something I needed to control anymore. This was something they needed to see for themselves, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply allow the truth to stand on its own. "It is not about what you said," I added after a moment, my voice calm, measured. "It is about how certain you were when you said it." And that distinction settled into the room with a quiet weight, because it spoke to something deeper than a single conversation. It spoke to a mindset, a belief, an assumption that had already taken root long before any words were spoken out loud. Rachel's expression tightened again, her composure slipping further as she struggled to find a response that would regain the ground she had lost. But there are moments when words are no longer enough, when the structure of an argument collapses under the weight of its own contradictions, and I could see that happening now, slowly but unmistakably. Daniel finally looked at her again, and this time there was no immediate agreement, no automatic alignment, only a quiet, searching uncertainty, and I realized then that whatever happened next, whatever decisions were made moving forward, this moment had already changed something that could not be easily restored, because once you see clearly, once you understand what was once hidden in plain sight, you cannot go back to not knowing. And I had not created that clarity, I had simply given it a place to be seen. The room did not return to what it had been before, not even close, because once something shifts at that level, once the foundation beneath a relationship is exposed, there is no easy way to place everything back where it was, and I could see that reality settling in around us, quiet but unmistakable, like dust slowly falling after something has been disturbed. Daniel sat there for a long moment, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze lowered as if he were looking for something familiar in a place that no longer felt the same. And when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a weight that had not been there before. I did not realize it had gone this far. And I listened to him, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, but with the kind of understanding that comes when you have already lived through the realization someone else is just beginning to face. It did not have explanation fit with what he was now starting to see. Rachel, however, did not accept that shift so easily, her expression tightening again as she leaned forward, her voice controlled but insistent. "This is being blown out of proportion. Daniel, you know that. We have always been planning responsibly, thinking ahead. That is not something to be punished for." And she spoke directly to him, not to me, as though trying to re-establish the alignment that had always worked in her favor. But this time, he did not immediately respond, and that pause, that hesitation, seemed to unsettle her more than anything else that had been said so far. Mr. Collins remained still, observing without interruption, his presence steady, a reminder that what had been set into motion was not subject to negotiation or reinterpretation, and that quiet certainty seemed to hold the room in place, preventing the conversation from drifting back into familiar patterns. "It is not about planning," Daniel said finally, his voice slower now, more deliberate. as if he were choosing each word carefully. It is about what you assumed. And the moment those words left his mouth, I saw Rachel's expression change again, not dramatically, but enough to reveal that she had not expected him to say that, not expected him to step even slightly outside the line she had drawn for him over the years. I assumed we would take care of things the way they needed to be handled. She replied quickly, her tone sharper now, less controlled. That is what people do. They make decisions, they move forward. That does not mean anything was wrong. But her words did not land the same way they might have before, not in a room where assumptions had already been laid bare for what they were. I watched them quietly, not stepping in, not redirecting, because this was no longer something I needed to manage. This was something they needed to confront on their own, and sometimes the clearest truths emerge not from what is said directly, but from what unfolds when people are left to respond without guidance. Daniel exhaled slowly, his posture shifting as if he were settling into a new understanding that was still unfamiliar, and he looked at me again, this time with something closer to recognition than confusion. You changed it because of that night, he said, and I nodded once. Not elaborating, not needing to explain further, because the connection was clear, the cause and effect already established without the need for additional detail. Rachel shook her head again, more forcefully this time. Her frustration no longer contained beneath careful phrasing. This is not fair. You made a permanent decision based on a private conversation, something that was never meant to be taken this way. And I considered her words for a moment, not because they held weight, but because they reflected a belief that had guided her actions all along, that what is said in private somehow exists without consequence, that intention can remain separate from accountability if it is not openly declared. It was not private, I said, my voice steady. It was simply not meant for me to hear. And that distinction settled into the space between us, quiet but definitive, because it removed the illusion she was trying to maintain, the idea that what had been revealed was somehow invalid simply because it had not been intended for my awareness. Daniel looked at her again, and this time there was no hesitation, no immediate agreement, only a steady gaze that suggested he was finally seeing the full picture, not just the version he had been given, and Rachel met that look with a flicker of something uncertain, something she could not easily reshape or redirect, and in that moment, I realized that whatever came next, whatever decisions were made from here, the balance had already shifted in a way that could not be undone, not by explanation, not by argument, not even by time, because once clarity takes hold, it does not simply fade away, it stays, reshaping everything that follows. The silence that followed did not feel uncertain anymore. It felt settled, as if something invisible had finally taken its rightful place in the room, something that had been avoided for far too long, but could no longer be ignored. And I watched as Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair, his expression no longer searching but absorbing, as though he was beginning to understand not just what had happened here, but what had been happening for a long time without his full awareness. Rachel, on the other hand, had not reached that place, not yet, and I could see it in the way she held herself, in the tension that had settled into her shoulders, in the way her eyes moved quickly between me and the lawyer, as if still looking for a way to undo what had already been made final. So that is it then, she said, her voice quieter now, but still edged with disbelief. Everything is gone because of something that was never meant to matter. And I noticed how she framed it, how she reduced it to a single moment, a single conversation, as though the rest of it did not exist, as though the pattern, the consistency, the certainty behind her words had no weight at all. I did not respond immediately, because I had learned that sometimes the most important things are not said in response to what is spoken, but in contrast to it, and instead I let her words settle, let them stand on their own, before I said, it mattered because it was honest, and that was the difference she had not accounted for, the difference that changed everything. Daniel looked at me again, and this time there was no confusion in his eyes, only a quiet recognition that carried both understanding and something else, something heavier, something closer to regret, and he nodded slightly, not in agreement with what had happened, but in acknowledgement of why it had happened, and that small gesture spoke more than anything he could have said out loud. Mr. Collins closed the folder in front of him, the soft sound of paper meeting paper marking a kind of conclusion that did not need to be announced, and he placed his hands on the table again, his role complete, his presence now simply a witness to what unfolded next. Rachel exhaled slowly, her composure no longer as carefully maintained as it had been when she first walked into the room, and she looked at Daniel again, searching for reassurance, for alignment, for the familiar response she had always relied on. But it did not come, not in the way she expected, and I saw the moment that realization settled in. The moment she understood that something between them had shifted in a way she could not easily control. "We can still fix this," she said, though her voice lacked the certainty it once carried. "There has to be a way to fix this." And I watched her carefully, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet clarity that had taken me years to reach, because I understood now that this was not about what had been lost, it was about what had been revealed. "There is nothing to fix," I said, my voice calm, steady, not raised, not forced, simply certain, and the words seemed to settle into the room with a finality that could not be argued against, because they were not based on emotion, they were based on understanding. Daniel remained still for a moment longer, then slowly stood, his movements measured, deliberate, as if he were adjusting to a reality that felt unfamiliar but undeniable, and he looked at me one more time, not as someone seeking an answer, but as someone acknowledging one, and I held his gaze without expectation, without demand, because this was not a moment that required anything from him. It was simply a moment that required him to see. Rachel stood as well, though her movements were less steady, her composure still trying to catch up with the shift that had already taken place, and she looked between us again, as if hoping for something that might restore what had been lost. But there are moments when restoration is no longer possible, when what has been revealed cannot be hidden again, and this was one of those moments. I rose from my seat then, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same quiet control I had carried throughout this entire process, and I adjusted the sleeve of my coat, a small, ordinary gesture that felt strangely significant in its simplicity, and as I turned toward the door, I paused just long enough to look back at them both, not to explain, not to justify, but simply to acknowledge the truth that now stood between us, clear and unalterable, and then I walked away, not because I had lost something, but because I had finally seen it clearly enough to let it go. The hallway outside felt quieter than it should have, as though the building itself had absorbed what had just happened and decided not to disturb it, and I walked slowly, not because I needed time, but because for the first time in a long while, I was not being pulled in any direction that was not my own. The air was cool, steady, and I noticed small things I had not paid attention to before, the faint hum of the overhead lights, the soft echo of my steps against the polished floor, the way my reflection moved alongside me in the glass panels as I passed. And it struck me how long it had been since I had felt this kind of stillness without it being filled with something else, something heavier, something unresolved. Behind me, I could hear the door open, then close again, and I did not need to turn around to know who it was, because there was only one person who would follow me now, not out of obligation, not out of expectation, but because something inside him had shifted enough to make him move. "Mom," Daniel's voice called, not loud, not urgent, but different from before, stripped of the assumptions that had once shaped it, and I stopped, turning just enough to face him without stepping back into the space I had just left. He stood a few feet away, his posture uncertain but not hesitant, as if he were trying to find the right way to stand in a moment that no longer followed the patterns he was used to, and for a second, neither of us spoke, because there are moments when words take time to catch up with understanding. "I did not see it," he said finally, his voice steady but quieter than I had ever heard it, and I nodded once, not because I needed to confirm it, but because I already knew it. I had known it long before today, long before that conversation in the hallway, long before any of this had reached the point where it could no longer be ignored. "You were not meant to," I replied, and that was the truth of it, not an excuse, not a justification, simply an acknowledgement of how easily people can miss what they are not looking for, especially when it is hidden behind something familiar, something trusted. He took a small step closer, not enough to close the distance entirely, but enough to show that he was no longer standing where he had been before, and he ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I remembered from years ago, from moments when he was trying to process something he did not yet fully understand. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked, and I considered that question carefully, not because I needed time to think, but because I understood what he was really asking, not just about the situation, not just about what had been lost, but about whether there was a way to return to something that felt intact, something that felt like it had before. No, I said gently, not coldly, not harshly, just honestly, and he nodded again, this time more slowly, as if he had expected that answer even before he asked the question. For a moment, we stood there in that quiet space, not as we had been before, not as a mother and son bound by routine and assumption, but as two people who had finally seen something clearly, even if it had come at a cost neither of us had fully anticipated. I am sorry, he said then, and those words carried more weight than anything else he could have offered, not because they changed what had happened, but because they acknowledged it without trying to reshape it, without trying to make it something else. And I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, I saw not the distance that had grown between us, but the possibility of something more honest taking its place. I know, I replied, and that was enough. Not forgiveness in the way people often expect it, not a resolution neatly tied together, but something quieter, something more real, the beginning of understanding rather than the end of conflict. He did not try to follow me further after that, did not ask me to stay or to come back, and I appreciated that more than anything else, because it showed that he was beginning to understand the difference between holding on and respecting space, between fixing something and allowing it to become what it needed to be. I turned then and continued down the hallway, my steps steady, my pace unhurried, and as I reached the exit, I pushed the door open and stepped outside, the late afternoon light stretching across the parking lot in long, soft lines, the sky clear, the air carrying that quiet sense of transition that comes at the end of a day. I paused for a moment, taking it in, not because I was unsure of what came next, but because I finally felt ready to move forward without needing to look back. And as I walked toward my car, I realized that I had not taken anything from them. Not really. I had simply allowed them to reveal what they were willing to take, and in doing so, I had given myself something far more valuable than anything written in that document, something that could not be divided or transferred or claimed, and that was clarity.